For those of you who are unfamiliar with film, film is a photographic medium that records images using light-sensitive chemicals instead of a digital sensor. Film works when photons hit the light-sensitive crystals on the film and cause a chemical change in the film that creates what's called a latent image. That latent image becomes an actual image when the film is developed in film processing chemicals. This video discusses Rollei Retro ADS and 80 ISO extended sensitivity film and looks at how to use it, the film's characteristics, technical details, shooting infrared images with this film, and this video also provides sample images shot with Rollei Retro 80. Mako rates Rollei Retro ADS at 80 ISO, which is 20 DIN. Now the ISO for this film is based on the historic Avifot 80 ASA ratings, which were derived well before ISO standard testing was standardized. However, 80 ISO is an accurate rating for this film on the upper end of what you can really do ISO-wise with this film. Rollei Retro ADS does not push well, but it can be very effectively pulled one stop to 40 ISO. Pulling it beyond 40 ISO delivers results that are way too flat for effective use. Pushing the film beyond 80 ISO delivers results so high in contrast as to be visually unpalatable for most uses. Rollei Retro ADS is available in 35mm, both 100-foot and in prepackaged 36-frame canisters, as well as in 120. Currently it is not available in sheet film, unfortunately, because this would be an amazing sheet film. Mako, if you're listening. Rollei Retro ADS is a black and white super panchromatic film. Now, super panchromatic is the maker's term, and my take on that is that it's mostly for marketing. I think a better term for this film would be an extended sensitivity panchromatic film. It sees all the visible light that we see as humans, but also sees ultraviolet and infrared. Retro ADS is a very fine-grain film with excellent intergrain contrast, which is called acutance. The film also has spectacular tonality if it's exposed and processed well. The tonal range on ADS, again, if exposed and developed well, can match or exceed many black and white films. So if you've heard complaints about this film, and these are fairly common, being overly contrasty, yes, Rollei Retro ADS can be overly contrasty, but it doesn't have to be. The large tonal range for Rollei Retro ADS stems from the film having sensitivity from the ultraviolet into the infrared spectrum, and we'll see that shortly when we look at the film's spectral sensitivity line. The film's tonality also derives from the characteristic curve having a generally gentle slope to it if the film is developed properly, and that contributes to a nice tonal gradation. The tonality achieved by ADS looks natural, but it also captures light we can't see, which results in flattering tonal rendition for many subjects, especially people. Retro ADS also has a very nice gamma, and we'll see that when we look at the film's characteristic curve. There is one thing to notice about this film, and that's that the base is clear. So if this film were reverse processed, it has the potential to be a great slide film. Now, I'm stepping a little bit out of my comfort zone with this next statement, but I understand that due to the film having a clear base, that it should have the potential to make this film good for use in motion work with an audio track. The clear base makes this film more susceptible than other films to dust on the negative showing up on images, whether it's printed in a darkroom or captured digitally. This is particularly problematic with low-key photos, but it also manifests whenever there is a large, uniformly toned area, such as a sky or studio backdrop, in the photograph. Retro ADS is an exceedingly sharp film rated 180 line pairs per millimeter. Also, the layer thickness of the emulsion is 10 nanometers. Now that thin layer thickness helps to ensure that light is not scattered by the emulsion, which improves overall image sharpness. There are a lot of really good uses for this film. It's exceptional for portraits due to the IR sensitivity. Infrared light flatters people's skin tones and adds a faint glow and softness that most people find visually appealing. Combined with what we'll see as a low blue sensitivity, That makes this a really great portrait film. This film, because it has the IR sensitivity, can also be used for infrared work. And if you feel you have a calling to photograph skies with black and white film, or if your work uses skies, as mine often does, as an important image element, this film will make your skies look fantastic without requiring the use of additional filters. In terms of digital conversion, Retro ADS converts to digital images better than most films. The grain is small enough that cloning out image imperfections does not leave a grain pattern scar, as happens with fast films like Delta 3200 or Tri-X 400. The tonal range on this film digitizes nicely, and the clear base, if you use a DSLR to digitize your film like I do, helps make images pop with nice contrast on top of an excellent tonal range that derives from proper handling and development. So here's the film's spectral sensitivity curve, and what this tells you is how well the film sees light of each wavelength. So let's take a look at a few things right off the bat. Firstly, yes, this film sees ultraviolet light and infrared. It sees well beyond our ability as humans to see because it can go beyond visible light. Second, that is a gorgeous spectral sensitivity line. Everything about this line says that this is a great portrait and landscape film. So the film extends into the UV and IR spectra. The UV spectra doesn't matter much for most use because UV light is blocked almost entirely by the glass in camera lenses. So the vast majority of UV light can't even reach the film when you have a lens on your camera. Now, if you use a pinhole camera, you will be able to record UV light with this film. Most of the UV light that will be recorded by this film, however, would still be overpowered by the visual light when you're using a pinhole camera. So even on pinholes, UV light won't have a huge influence on the final images. Now, this film also records into the IR space. So yes, you can use it for low IR spectrum photography. This also, to an extent, saps your film of some sharpness, though not a whole lot, because it takes a whole lot more infrared light to obtain an equivalent exposure compared to visible spectrum light. IR light focuses on a different plane than visible light, which is why IR sensitive films tend to have a glow or a softness around some of the subjects if enough IR light is recorded when you're taking a visible light photo for that to happen. And that does happen sometimes with Rollei Retro ADS, depending on the circumstances and your camera settings. One thing that does mean is that your studio photos, all things being even, would be very slightly sharper than your outdoor work with this film, for the simple fact that there is less infrared light in a studio setting than there is outside. So there is a very important note on using this film, especially in a studio setting or outdoors with a flash. Looking here at the spectral sensitivity curve, you can see on the left how much lower the blue sensitivity is than the sensitivity to the warmer color range. That has special ramifications for flash use. Xenon bulbs create a blue light, and this film is less sensitive to blue light. So when using this film with a flash, you will need to experiment first to see what settings will work, because you will either need to open up your lens 1 to 2 stops or overclock your flash by 1 to 2 stops. Now, the specific effect of the reduced blue sensitivity on flash use will vary by your flash based on flash temperature, make, and things like that, your studio setting, etc. So you will want to check your flash's color temperature to understand how profound the light loss from using a flash will be compared to using outdoor light, for instance. So if you have a cool flash, let's say about 6,000 Kelvin and higher, you will probably have issues with how this light records the light from your flash. If you have a warmer flash, let's say 3,000 Kelvin and warmer or lower, or if you use gels to warm the light from your flash, you will have fewer issues with this film picking up the light from your flash. This color sensitivity will also have ramifications for sunlight reflectors, as gold tone reflectors will likely create light more readily recorded by this film than silver tone reflectors. So when you read this chart, understand that the lower the line is on the chart, the more that color of light, the wavelength associated with that space that the line is crossing, the more that color will be darker on the finished images. So blues, for instance, will be darker on this film than an equivalently toned yellow or red. In practical application, that means that skies will be darker gray than the clouds, and that the clouds will pop out of the skies much more so than with other films. In fact, when using this film, I found that there were days I couldn't see those thin, wispy cirrus clouds way up in the sky, but when I got the images back, those clouds were visible on the images. Now, this also means that the film works well for portraits because a reduced blue sensitivity in film can help reduce the appearance of skin flaws, while the increased red sensitivity into the IR can help give people a healthier looking glow. So seriously, when you try this film, ask someone you know to sit down for a roll and just take photos of them. Take up a whole roll taking photos of them. I would be stunned if the results from that session were not very pleasing for you. So this is a really impressive characteristic curve. For this discussion, let's look at the solid line, which in the data handout corresponds to G74C developer at 30 degrees Celsius. That curve is closest to the curve that will make this film's images look their best. All of what we'll look at in this film's characteristic curve assumes proper development. Firstly, check out how low the base fog is on this film. That's important because it means that the base layer is clear. And it is, more so than any other film I've used, with the possible exception of ADOX CMS22. That lack of base fog on Rollei Retro ADS is part of what yields this film's characteristic contrast profile and is a lot of what contributes to this image's look. Next, you can see that the inertia point on this film is fairly far to the left, meaning that this film starts being exposed quickly and early in the exposure. The toe on this film is long, meaning that the film will have a nice shadow characteristic and that it can deliver nice tonal range and detail within the shadow areas. The film's straight line is long and gently slopes upward, indicating that the film has a gradual tonal range. Now again, this assumes a good development. There's no shoulder on this film if it's developed well, and the Dmax is abrupt on this chart, indicating that highlights can blow out easily and quickly if the film isn't handled well. This aligns with my experience using the film, and a good way to mitigate this highlight blowout tendency is to shoot Rollei Retro ADS at 40 ISO. Now, when you pull a film, and this is true of any film, when you're pulling a film pulls back highlight development. When you develop film in chemistry, the highlights develop last. So if the film is in the chemistry for less time, there is less time for the highlights to develop. So pulling the film increases highlight detail while preserving shadow detail. So Retro ADS is an excellent 40 ISO film. This chart also shows the relationship between developing times. In the original chart, each line shows a different developing time from 20 seconds to 70 seconds. That's lines 1 to 6 respectively. You can see here that less development results in a flatter, lower contrast image, while longer development yields a higher contrast image with a greater dynamic range from floor to ceiling, that is. You will lose some tones in that range compared to the shorter developing times. Underdeveloping this film will be most noticeable in the highlight areas being muddy, whereas overdeveloping this film will be most noticeable in the shadow areas being featureless. I could not find reciprocity data on ADS. This may be because the film was never intended to be used for long exposures, especially at night. So to that end, if you need to calculate reciprocity failure, use reciprocity data for another slow film like Pan F50 by Ilford or ADOX CMS22. A good starting point would be to add half a stop of light when you're slower than 1 second and faster than 1/1000th. If you're beyond 1/4000th of a second, which realistically you won't be with this film, you'd want to add a full stop of light. Mako provides development data for Rollei Retro ADS from 20 to 160 ISO. The massive development chart provides a good array of ratings for this film, but some of the data on the development chart are imperfect. I pushed this film past 160 ISO and pulled it down to 20 as well. I found that at the rated ISO, Retro ADS delivers nice but slightly contrasty results, and that at 40 ISO the results were more pleasing. At 20 ISO the results were muddy and flat. Pushing the film yielded a significant but unpalatable contrast increase with lost shadow detail. Now this, I later learned, is because the film loses sensitivity as it's overdeveloped. And that means that the longer the film is in the developer, the less sensitivity the finished image is going to have. So pushing this film in developer will cause it to lose sensitivity to light because the film has to soak in the developer for longer. In the old Avifot 80 datasheet, AGFA provided data for this film from ISO 64 to 100. But the data indicates that pushing the film past 80 ISO delivers a speed loss quickly under some developing conditions. So in a nutshell, pull Retro ADS, but don't push it. Also expect that you'll need to make some mistakes with this film because it does have a pretty steep learning curve. I liked ADS's results the best when I shot it at 40 ISO. 40 ISO worked well because the developing time is shorter, and that helps to preserve the film's sensitivity and reduce the fog which is caused on this film by longer developer baths. At 40 ISO, the film also exhibited nice tonal qualities. Also, if you use filters, Mako has their own set of filter factors to use, and I found that my cameras underexposed the film with filters other than yellow. So ignore filter maker filter factors if you're going to use filters and go to Mako's ratings for this film. I believe that the different filter factors Mako provides versus standard filter factors are due to the film's extended light sensitivity. Case in point, I have a red filter, and it removes 2 stops of light from every image. And with every other film I've used it on, the camera meters 2 stops slower, and everything turns out fine. With this film, the camera meters 2 stops slower, but the Retro ADS images were still consistently 2 stops underexposed, and that aligns with Mako's guidance to add 4 stops of light to images when shot through a red filter. I only have one other recommended setting, and that's that when using a flash, you really need to jack the power up on it or open up your aperture. My flash experiments with this film were all unsuccessful because I did not adjust my settings properly. Before we talk about specific developers that I like, I have some specific tips on developing this particular film in general because Retro ADS is persnickety. If you overdevelop this film, you can easily reduce its sensitivity, yielding a result that is both underexposed and overdeveloped, but not in a good way. The base layer on this film is also subject to overdevelopment, and the base fog increases, and with some developers this is drastic, as the development time progresses. Now base fog, what I mean by that, it's where unexposed silver crystals, kind of like a creepy guy wearing a trench coat on a school playground, spontaneously expose themselves. With overdevelopment, this can be exaggerated, and that robs the images of contrast and tonal range. Now this graphic here shows a fog density curve over time. In the source, the solid line development is with Gevatone 74C, and the dashed line is the same developer with AD74 additive. Now I believe both of those are obsolete out of production chemicals. My experience with this film is that the solid line is pretty close to representing the way that the base fog looks when the film is properly developed in good and fresh chemistry. The dashed line is closer to the way that the film looks when the film is developed incorrectly or with poor quality chemistry such as an admixture from an old stock solution. I've tried a number of developers with Retro ADS, D76 in both stock and 1+1, Ilfosol 3 at both +9 and +14, Microdol X +3, Rodinol at +25, +50, and +100 with stand developing, Rollei RPXD at +19, and Ultrafin Plus at +4. I also tried multiple ISOs with some of those developers. D76 was my most vexing developer. When the results were good, they were great. But retro ADS does not respond well to D76, which has been previously used, or that is more than about a month old. So ultimately, I don't recommend D76 for retro ADS unless it's fresh in the last week, maybe two. The results from D76, though sometimes good, were also defined by harsh tones and contrasts and some lost mid-range tonality. This stems from the developer time needed for D76. As you'll recall from earlier, the longer the film is developed, the more sensitivity it loses and the more that base fog increases. So when using ADS, you want to develop it fast and get the film into the stop. That preserves the clear base and tonal range. My favorite developer for ADS by far was Ilfosol 3 at 1+9 for 5 minutes. D76 stock, when pulling the film to 40 ISO, was a pretty close second. Rollei at 1+25 for 6 minutes also performed very nicely some of the time. Now, these combinations yielded nice grain structure with excellent tonality without the negatives being thin. All the developers developed negatives that needed far more dust removal cloning than typical film stocks, however. And this is a direct result of the film's clear base. So watch this clip here, which is sped up from about 5 minutes of cloning out dust spots on a single negative. Dust is much more of an issue with clear base films than non-clear base films because it stands out. It's like the difference of having a fingerprint on a wall, which you can't see, versus having a fingerprint on a clean window pane. Films like retro ADS really show dust, whereas films like HP5 Plus and T-Max, not as much. So this problem is exacerbated in areas like skies or in low-key images where there is either consistent tonality without image detail or gradation without detail. That means that cleaning dust spots off of your images in post is much more important than it is with other films and frankly much more time consuming. To mitigate the amount of post-work cloning that you have to do, you want to make sure that your film is as clean as possible. Rinse it with photo flow or distilled water, dry it in a dust-free environment. Those things are vital to using this film in a dark room or digitizing it without then also spending hours cleaning up each frame. Also, with ADS, prioritize your tonality over all characteristics in your development. Controlling tonal range and gradients with ADS in developing is very challenging, but if you can develop to have good gradients and tonal range, the rest of the image characteristics are going to fall into place. I strongly recommend against Rollei RPXD plus 19, which yielded consistently thin results with excessive grain. D76 1+1 was not a combination I found to deliver consistently pleasing results, and Rollei in any dilution other than plus 25 yielded mixed results, with some images looking great while others were terrible, and sometimes you'd have a great properly developed image on the same roll as ones that weren't great and properly developed, or you'd have one roll that turned out well and another one that didn't, and they were in the same tank. So Rollei can deliver good results, but it seems to be a little bit unpredictable in the way it reacts to this film when the Rollei's at weak concentrations. To shoot infrared with Rollei Retro ADS, meter your camera at 3 ISO. Take your meter reading with no infrared filter on the camera. Your camera also will not meter down to 3 ISO, and at best, it's going to meter to 6. So all of your shooting has to be in full manual mode. So there are some cameras that simply will not work for IR shooting with this film because they don't have a full manual mode or they don't have the ability to override DX. So if you want to shoot IR with this film, your best bet is to make sure you have an older, fully manual camera with a lens that has an IR index on it. So let's assume that, like most cameras, the one you're using meters to ISO 25 as its lowest ISO. You'll need to count down stops to get to 3 ISO. So 25 to 12 ISO is 1 stop, 12 to 6 ISO is 2, and 6 to 3 ISO is 3 stops. So if you meter at 25 ISO, you'll need to add 3 stops of light for your IR work. Now what that means is that if you meter at 25 ISO and your camera says it at f2, you need 1/15 of a second, then in reality what you need is 1/8, 1/4, 1/2, which is about right unless you're shooting in bright sun, because IR sensitivity is really low. Now, once you've metered your image, compose and focus your shot. This is easily done with a tripod, though admittedly I shot handheld for all of these sample IR images. After focusing, note where your focal point is and attach the IR filter to your lens. Next, adjust your focal point so that what was in focus previously now aligns with your lens's IR focal indicator. And that's usually a red dot or the letter R, and it's going to be to one side, left or right, of the typical focal indicator on your lens. Not all lenses have this. If your lens lacks an IR focus indicator, you will have a difficult time obtaining accurate IR focus, and that's probably not a lens that's worth using for infrared work. Also, you do need a fast lens for this whole thing to work. I shot most of these IR photos from f1.4 to f2 in full California sun, because at f2.8 the exposure time for infrared was around 1/2 of a second. Understand that IR light is slightly softer than visible light when focused by a camera lens, so embrace that aesthetic and don't fight it. I like Retro ADS a lot. It's a top 5 black and white film for me, up there with the likes of Acros, Silvermax, and CMS22. There are a number of subjects for which this film is a great choice, and many subjects for which it's a bad choice. Portraits, landscapes, fine artworks, scientific imagery, and especially scientific landscape work are great uses for ADS. Sports, architecture, astrophotography, and flash photography are some of the types of work for which a different film would be a better option. ADS is also persnickety, and it doesn't get along with some of the common developers. It likes a fast development time and chemistry that tends to deliver flatter results. And it likes its chemistry like I like my tuna sandwiches, fresh. An old tuna sandwich, like the one I, back in 1993, left in my high school's 30-year time capsule, is similar to old film developer and is always a bad idea. This film makes old developer an even worse idea. If you set out to use Rollei Retro ADS, understand that it's got a long learning curve, especially compared to many other easily used films. If you haven't used a high contrast film before, you will mess up a good number of rolls of this. So if you haven't used a high contrast film and you want to use Retro ADS, get at least 5 rolls and don't shoot the second until you see what you did wrong on the first. Don't shoot the third until you see what went wrong on the second, and so forth. This is not a film that anyone can pick up, shoot away on, and expect good results all the time. Retro ADS does deliver amazing results, but it makes you earn them first. Once you learn how to make this film sing, though, it has a voice unlike any other film on the market.